Everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss the very interesting findings of the Palgrave Handbook on Global Philanthropy. My name is Ana Pinho. I'm Wink's Knowledge Management Coordinator, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we start, I just want to make sure we go through a very few things about using WebEx, the platform we're using today. Make sure you click on connect to audio, or connect using computer, and so that you can hear us and that we can hear you on Q&A time. If you lose your internet connection, don't panic. Just reconnect using the link we emailed you before the webinar. You can adjust your audio settings on the top menu on the audio button. And to ask any questions to the presenters, you can type a question on the chat box to either me, Ana Pinho, or to Wing staff. If you're using a telephone to listen to the webinar, make sure you use a landline, because cellular phones might interrupt the connections. And this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on Wing's website and YouTube channel. So here, just for you to go through quickly, make sure you're connected to audio, and you write your questions on the chat box. So Wings is very proud to host this webinar. We are a network of associations and support organizations serving philanthropy, and we do that through leadership and advocacy programs, network building programs, and knowledge programs, where we try to share knowledge within the field, and this webinar is part of it. So with no further ado, I'll pass the word to Pamala Wiepking from the Erasmus University, who will make a brief introduction of the topic, and will introduce our next speakers as well. Pamala? Pamala, can you hear us? Hi, Pamala might be having a few issues connecting. And meanwhile, just make sure you don't use your videos, just close the videos. And that you are muted so that we avoid background noise. Thank you very much for your understanding. Hi, Pamala, can you hear us? Hello, I'd just like to highlight that you should turn off your cameras. Thank you very much, because that might interfere in the connection here. Thank you.
Do you hear me?
Yes, Pamala, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. So Shall I
That's
start?
absolutely fine. Yes,
Okay.
please. Thank
Okay.
you.
So I'm so sorry, everyone, for this inconvenience. I don't know what happened to my audio, but thank you, Anna, for having us here at the Global at the WING seminar to have us present our research on global philanthropy. We'd love to share the results of our study we conducted in order to publish the Palgrave Handbook on Global Philanthropy, and we hope that what we did will be helpful to you all working in the philanthropy field, doing all the important work you are doing in helping you to understand and work with your clients or with the philanthropic organizations you work with. I would like to start by introducing the Palgrave Handbook of Philanthropy, of course by introducing some of the people who worked on this. When we started this project in 2009, we started out by thinking what is the most interesting question we can think of as philanthropy scholars we can answer. And we thought, well, that has to be a study into global philanthropy. We want to understand how we can understand global differences in giving. So Famida Handy, who is the co-editor of the book, and I sought out several philanthropy experts across the world which we could answer this question, because of course if you want to answer such a large question, you cannot do that alone. You need all the experts from people working inside different countries and from people who have a knowledge on specialty topics we also wanted to cover. So here you see the pictures also of Chris Einolf and Beth Breeze, who will also present the results of their study on, first of all, the social origins of the nonprofit sector, and Beth Breeze will present on fundraising. So we thought we wanted to answer why are some people why do people in one country donate more frequently and more generously to charitable organizations than people in another country? We want to understand specifically what is it in the context, in the culture of a country that drives people to be more generous. This is in addition to the individual factors you can use to explain cross-national difference in philanthropy. Because if in a country people are higher educated on average, or if they have a higher income on average, we know that there are more generous donors. So if in one country many more people are higher educated and have a high income, of course people in that country will be more generous. But what we specifically were interested in studying is the contextual factors. Which differences between countries facilitate or inhibit philanthropic behavior? How can we explain that people in one country are more generous than people in another country based on the context in which they live? And the key objective of the project was to facilitate an increased understanding of the practice of philanthropy and the factors that drive philanthropy across these different nations. So what we did in order to achieve this is sought contact to with as many people as possible we could find that were philanthropy experts in different countries and different regions. And as you can see here on this map of the countries represented in the Palgrave Handbook, unfortunately, we do not cover all parts of the world. This has to do with our initial selection criteria for the countries included, is that we wanted to have them micro-level data on giving in these countries. So we wanted to have available data to analyze why some people are more generous than other people in that country. And unfortunately, in large areas of the world, there is no such data on giving. There is, of course, there is the Charities Aid Foundation and the Gallup World Poll data on whether or not people gave money over the past month, but what we wanted to know is how much do people give. And for the countries included in our book, we were happy to include the analysis of that type of data. The difference... The different country chapters included... The different country chapters included all started out with the same idea. We wanted the people working from these countries to include the information we knew from the literature that might drive philanthropy, the contextual factors we knew from the literature, for example, the historical development of the nonprofit sector in a country, or the government support that the nonprofit sector receives in a country. The fiscal incentives is another example, but also religious culture can be very important. So by having these philanthropy experts from all these countries cover these different contextual factors of philanthropy in these countries, we can hopefully help as many other people interested in philanthropy across the world to understand philanthropy in these countries. So in addition to these country chapters, we also asked different philanthropy experts to write on specialty topics related to philanthropy. And for one is the religious culture, tax regimes. Beth will present later on the organization of fundraising, a chapter she wrote with Wendy Sky from Australia. And Chris will present more on how international funding can promote a strong non-profit sector based on his chapter on the social origins of the non-profit sector. And also Frank Nguyen wrote a very interesting chapter about the government support for the non-profit sector. So I would like to, and in the end, Pamala and I wrote an overarching chapter in which we tried to distill all the contextual factors that drive philanthropy across these nations. So I would now like to give the word to Chris, who will present on how international funding can promote a stronger nonprofit sector.
Thank you so much, Pamala. I'd just like to make sure you're all muted so that we avoid background noise and that you don't use your video. Thanks. Chris?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay, so as soon as my little slides come up, but I can start talking. My title of my presentation is How Can International Funding Develop a Strong Independent Nonprofit Sector? Now that's the last slide there, so if you could go back to the first one, it'd be great. Okay, you're gonna get my presentation in reverse here. There you go. So the question that I had, essentially I'm looking at the same thing that Pamela was, which was why does charitable giving vary from country to country? And if you go to the next slide, or I guess I can do that, right? Yeah. There you go. Right, so the goals of international philanthropy. So we have, you know, many of you on this call do international philanthropy, and you have several goals. One is just to support the mission of overseas nonprofits. So, you know, you're helping them feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, and so on and so forth. But while you're doing that, you're typically also trying to build their internal capacity. So their ability to, you know, fundraise and to do their jobs more effectively. Maybe you're training the staff. What I'm looking at is how international philanthropy can help build nonprofits' external capacity. So this means their sustainability, their ability to raise funds, and their independence in relation to the social environment and the political environment. Okay, so the research questions are how and why does charitable giving vary from country to country? The general question of the Palgrave Handbook, and also how can international funders support domestic giving? With the idea is that the more domestic people give to charity, the more locals give to charities, the more that the charity will be self-sustaining financially and also be able to be independent of government funding and influence. The data and method, do statistical analysis of the country-level data on charitable giving from the Palgrave Handbook, and I also extended it to the Gallup World Poll. The Gallup World Poll has this one question about did you give money to charity in the last month, which is it's just a yes/no, so it's kind of a simple question. But what's nice about the World Poll is they have over 100 countries in it. So you can really extend it very far and see if these patterns apply more broadly. And then I also looked at the case studies from the country chapters in the Palgrave Handbook. So how and why charitable giving varies? There's a kind of a simple set of variables, which are the economic and political differences among countries. And then there's a more complex story about the historical development of the welfare state and how that historical development affects the nonprofit sector. So the first one I can get through pretty quickly, and the second one takes more of a in-depth explanation. Economy and politics, so both in the Palgrave Handbook chapters and in the Gallup World Poll, looking at over 100 countries, these are the characteristics of countries that have higher rates of charitable giving. So these countries tend to be wealthier, higher GNP per capita. The government tends to spend more on social services. And then they're more politically developed. So there's more democracy and civil liberties. Government is rated as more effective, and government is rated as less corrupt, more honest. The second set of explanations has to do with the historical development of the welfare state in the nonprofit sector. And I'm drawing here on a theory that's called social origins theory. And this is from scholars Salomon and Anheuer. It's a pretty influential theory in our discipline. And it talks about the historical relations between classes, so economic classes, and the state. Those determine the size of the welfare state, and they also determine the size of the nonprofit sector, and then indirectly those influence how much people give to charity. So Salomon and Anheuer divide the countries of the developed world, and this is basically Europe and the UK and UK colonies, into three classes. So you have liberal countries, which is the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. These places, the middle class kind of dominated the formation of the government, and they don't have as much of a welfare state historically. The US still doesn't have one, the other ones have developed one. Social democratic countries, and these are like the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, and the Netherlands. These are ones in which the working class really dominated the government at the time of the formation of the welfare state. And they created this big and egalitarian welfare state where lots of people, pretty much everybody's covered and everybody's treated more or less the same. The third group, and that's most of the rest of Western Europe, is what's sort of called corporatist countries. And these countries also developed the welfare state, but the elites within the country retained power. And they created a welfare state that preserves class divisions. So people within the welfare state, people who are more upper class get different benefits and different status than people who are below. Now this all affects the development of the nonprofit sector. So in liberal countries, the nonprofit sector is large and independent. Remember, they don't have much of a welfare state, so the nonprofit sector steps in to do what the welfare state isn't doing. And people tend to give a lot to charity. In social democratic countries, you might expect that the nonprofit sector would be small because the welfare state is doing so much. But that actually isn't the case. The nonprofit sector is large. Instead of being independent, it's strong and has a lot of influence on government. And these countries also have a lot of charitable giving. In corporatist countries, the nonprofit sector tends to be smaller and tied to government. So instead of influencing the government, often the government's influencing it, or perhaps they're collaborating. And charitable giving tends to be lower in these countries. Now that's just the industrialized world. That's just the wealthy countries of Western Europe and US, Canada, Australia. What about the rest of the world? Well, the way I look at it is that the rest of the world, the other countries, are developing along this path. And we're not going to sure where they're going to end up. So most of the countries in the rest of the world have a smaller nonprofit sector and a weak welfare state, or a less active welfare state. They also just have less money to fund all these things. And a lot of countries in the rest of the world are not democratic countries. And particularly in non-democratic countries, there's a complex relationship between the government and the nonprofit sector. The governments like nonprofits, but they're also afraid of them. Why do they like them? Well, because nonprofits sort of do the government's job for it. They can raise funds on top of what the government raises through taxes, and they can provide services, and sometimes they can provide services more effectively than government. So that's all great, but the government is also afraid of the nonprofit sector because nonprofits can act independently. They can challenge government authority, and they can challenge government decisions. Where's the rest of the world going? Well, from my research into the country chapters, it looks like I didn't find any governments that were on this path to a liberal regime where the nonprofit sector is strong and independent, or to a social democratic regime. Most are on this sort of corporatist path. Basically, governments realize that the nonprofit sector is a powerful ally and even more powerful enemy, and governments are trying to maintain a close relationship with nonprofits in which they get the upper hand. They control it somewhat. So what can international funding do within this situation? You have nonprofits that are trying to develop, trying to retain an independent political voice, trying to raise money independently. How can international funding support their efforts? Well, a positive thing that they can do is they can give external support to nonprofits until they become self-sustaining, able to raise money on their own. They can also give support to nonprofits to help them retain their independence from the government. If they're not dependent on government funding, they can retain a more independent voice. But international funding can also make things worse. One thing is it can pump money into nonprofits that are not sustainable, and it can just sort of create this unsustainable nonprofit sector. And it can also legitimize nonprofits that are government controlled or co-opted. And there are examples in the Palgrave Handbook of all these outcomes. So some failures, the chapters on China and Vietnam are very interesting because the governments of these countries realized that having a good nonprofit sector is a good thing, and they set about to create one. So they have this nonprofit sector that's almost entirely controlled by the government. There are some independent elements, but the big nonprofits are very closely allied with government. And they created these essentially as a way to direct international funding and domestic charitable giving into organizations that the government controls. There's also information about the former Soviet republics. Kazakhstan is a good article on Kazakhstan. And basically the development sector pumped a lot of money into these countries after the fall of the Soviet Union, and it puffed up a lot of nonprofits that didn't really have enough grassroots support. So it created this weak aid-dependent nonprofit sector that in a lot of cases just kind of fell apart after international funding was withdrawn. But there's a lot of good news. If you look at Taiwan and South Korea, these are nonprofit sectors that started out small and government-controlled, but international funding supported economic development and political freedom, and it also helped the nonprofit sector become strong and independent. And now they have a pretty mature and independent nonprofit sector. If you look at Egypt and Indonesia, again, the nonprofit sector was somewhat independent and contributed to political change. So in conclusion, let me get the slide to advance. Oh, for some reason it doesn't like me. But in conclusion, we can learn 4 things about developing a strong independent nonprofit sector. So what can the international community do? Well, economic growth and political freedom are associated with increased charitable giving. So anything you're doing to promote that is good for charitable giving. Remember that nonprofits aren't always the best friend of government. They can be a threat. International funding can rail nonprofit capacity and independence, and there's 4 examples on that, but avoid the traps of either supporting and legitimizing a nonprofit sector that's really just a government agency, and avoid pumping money into a nonprofit sector that isn't ready for it yet, that exists only on paper. So that's my talk, and I think Beth is next, right?
Yes, thank you so much, Chris. And I'd like to remind you all that you can send questions throughout the presentations on the chat box. And I'll send them to our speakers, and they'll address them on the Q&A session. Beth?
So can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Oh, again, that's my last slide, Anna. So if we could move to the first one, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. And how do I move on, please? Can I don't think I have control at the moment. Oh, there we go, I have now. Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be part of this, this webinar today. In fact, it's my very first ever webinar, so please bear with me if I make any newbie rookie mistakes. As Pamela said at the very start, the chapter that I contributed to, in addition to writing the UK chapter, I worked with Wendy Scaife, who is the acting director of the Australian Centre on Philanthropy and the non-profit sector. And she and I were both delighted to have this chance to synthesize information about fundraising from 26 different countries to see what we could say about the current state of development of fundraising around the world. Let me see if I can move this. So here's what I want to do in my about 5 minutes. Firstly, just to briefly talk about the fact that we know an awful lot about donors, an increasing amount about donors, but really the demand side of philanthropy, the asking, the fundraisers, hasn't been given nearly as much attention, despite them really being 2 sides of the same coin. Then I want to run through what we found in the data around some of the commonalities and differences, and then end with a typology that Wendy and I came up with. Now, it's meant to provoke discussion. It's really the first starter, and I very much hope that some of the people, especially from countries around the world who are part of this webinar, will have a look at that typology, tell us what you think, and hopefully we can improve it as time goes on. So firstly, just to say that fundraising is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, in very simple terms. It's a person, a fundraiser, a person whose job or task is to seek financial support for a charity or a cause or another enterprise. But that really quite simple statement hides a very complex task, which isn't standardized and isn't well understood, and actually quite an onerous responsibility for the people who are charged with bringing in the money to keep good causes going across the world. Now, some people have tried to pin down what fundraising involves, in particular Hank Rosso's work, where he talks about fundraising as being the servant of philanthropy. But really, at the moment, I would argue, those of us who believe it to be a very respectable and respectful profession, a very helpful and enabling set of jobs and tasks, are up against perhaps what you could describe as a rather negative public attitudes, especially in the UK. And again, it'd be really interesting to hear what people are experiencing in other countries. Certainly in the UK, there's quite a lot of bad press for fundraisers. It's seen as sort of begging at and a kind of sales, harder sort of sales techniques, and really quite high pressured and aggressive, and really causing some distress to people who are on the receiving end of requests for funding. In addition to that rather difficult image of fundraising, fundraisers just really aren't very well known. Nobody sort of knows about them. There are no equivalent high-profile askers in the way you get high-profile philanthropists. And the final point to make here is about the academic study. So mea culpa, we all culpa. This little chart that I've got here to show you shows the sort of the rise in the number of academic articles about philanthropy as opposed to against fundraising. And in the last 5 years, there have been more articles on philanthropy than there have been on fundraising in the last 30 years. So, we really are at a fairly low level of understanding about fundraising. The chapter that Wendy and I wrote isn't a history of fundraising. We don't pretend to be able to provide that. But just really one point we did want to make here is that the methods and approaches that you find in modern fundraising have incredibly long roots. It is possible to look back and see over many centuries some of the techniques that we still see evident today and quite dominant today. So tithing, obviously, an awful lot of fundraising began in a religious context. Indulgences to fund capital projects in the medieval period. The picture at the top of this slide is of Troyes Cathedral in France, where there's a very nicely documented campaign to rebuild that cathedral after a fire in the 14th century, which drew on really many of the techniques we use now, talking to big donors, appealing for legacies, doing community.
And Beth, I think we lost you for a second. Can you hear us? Hi, Beth. We can't hear you.
Raising events.
And Beth?
Yes, hello?
Sorry to interrupt, but we lost you for a second.
Oh.
So, yeah, when you were kind of mid the last slide.
Oh, really? Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, never mind. The information was all on the slide, and I don't want to take up too much time. So shall I just carry on and talking about fundraising methods?
Oh, fantastic. Thanks.
Would that be okay? I'm so sorry. Nothing happened at my end. So really, this slide is just setting out what are the main methods that are used around the world, drawing on what the different country chapters emphasised in their writing. Fundraising events are found everywhere. They're omnipresent, partly because they rely on volunteer labour. So you don't need to have a highly organised charity sector. You just need people of goodwill with spare time. And interestingly, in the Caribbean chapter, we learned that when you have a situation where a number of spouses don't have work permits, for example, it can be that fundraising events are more easy to organise because there's a more plentiful supply of volunteer labour. I won't run through all 13, but just to bring out a few more highlights. One-to-one approaches is obviously the most historically the oldest method of simply asking people in the context of a personal relationship. But of course, it's very expensive. And so increasingly that method is only being used with the wealthiest donors who it's hoped will be able to donate the largest sums. So then the third method, direct marketing, this use of the mass marketing techniques found in the private and profit sector are being used by non-profits to great effect to some degree, but also to increasing backlash and criticism of the type that I alluded to at the beginning. And many countries are now trying to cope with how does one deal with the fact that people are feeling slightly overwhelmed by the amount of direct marketing they receive from non-profits. I do want to briefly mention about the online fundraising. It's not actually generating huge sums in any country just yet, but it's growing at a faster rate than other methods, and it can even outpace the overall development of the fundraising profession. And so, for example, in the Bulgarian chapter, we learned that 58% of people had given via SMS, which is much higher than in other countries which had a more developed fundraising regime. The only other one I'll pull out of here, partly because of Wings and the kind of people who I think are involved, is to note about the charitable trusts and foundations, that in some countries there's a very, very small, almost non-existent base of local funders. And so that means that rather small non-profits have to develop quite sophisticated understanding of the global trust and fundraising, trust and foundation sector. It necessitates them appealing across borders, which can be quite difficult for smaller charities in those kind of countries to achieve. Very happy to talk about more of those in the discussion, but let me move on so I don't take up more than the time that I've been allocated. Just to say, we did find a few commonalities across the world. The growth of fundraising bodies, so membership bodies, representative bodies, we found them in 21 out of the 26 countries. And those 5 that didn't have them, that really did seem to be indicative of a less developed fundraising regime. Education and training is definitely increasing around the world, but it's still only a handful of countries that can offer it at university level. Although obviously the development of online techniques means that people can offer, can study at a university that's based in a different country. So, for example, my university now offers a distance learning MA in Philanthropic Studies, which covers fundraising. And thirdly, we did find that government does tend to be involved in some way or another. It can range from quite light touch to really rather strongly prescriptive and involved, and that of course brings pros and cons. Common challenges around the world, I've already mentioned public concern about fundraising, costs and techniques, declining trust. It only takes one bad experience or experience of fraud in particular to make the whole sector lose trust and confidence across the population. And thirdly, the lack of talent. I spent yesterday speaking at a conference in London about fundraising talent, and it was described as a very small and leaky pool. There are not many people out there who are experienced at fundraising, and they tend to move charities rather quickly. So the main thing I want to talk about and to finish on is this typology that we came up with. As I say, it's suggestive rather than conclusive. And what we tried to do was to take all the evidence and group countries together to say where we think they are in terms of their development of fundraising. The advanced regime is one where there's a highly developed fundraising profession, really at the cutting edge of the techniques that they're using, that fundraisers are fully supported by bodies that represent and regulate them, and that the personal asks, the relationship fundraising is a dominant method. And as you can see, we only allocated the USA to that first type. The established regimes are ones where fundraising is really rather large and well organised. There is a national professional body, but fundraising tends to be a bit more mass solicitation rather than the personal asks. Evident is somewhere in the middle. You know, a few of the features of the established regime, a few of the features of the emerging. In the emerging, fundraising is growing in legitimacy, but it's not yet fully professionalised. The donor base can be quite small in those countries and can be quite overly reliant on fundraising from abroad. For example, in the situation I mentioned a few moments ago about not having a very strong local foundation sector. And then finally, the embryonic regimes, where there's really very little discernible development of fundraising as a profession, where it tends to be more about processing donations that come in, say, after a disaster, rather than having a particularly proactive fundraising regime. I've done some other studies looking at the kind of people who fundraise. I'm not going to say much about them, apart from just to share with you this very high-level list of summaries of the kind of features that I found from the sort of people who are good at fundraising, in particular good at major donor and one-to-one fundraising. And really just to point out that I'm not claiming in this research that there is any particular type who's a good fundraiser, but there are some common characteristics that might be useful for people to be aware of when they're trying to recruit and increase the talent pool of fundraisers. And the final thing I want to say really is that we've got a general view across the world now that there is a new philanthropy out there. There's the Zuckerberg-Chan announcement of their philanthropy just before Christmas is perhaps the latest in those high-tech mega announcements of philanthropy. But I just want to suggest that perhaps on the other side of the coin, the askers, there's something like the new fundraisers to complement the new philanthropists. And I've set out on that slide what I mean by that, the kind of people who've chosen fundraising as a career, who are perhaps more trained and professionalised and looking for the scientific basis for what they're doing. But again, I'd be very interested to hear whether that rings true with the people who are listening to this webinar. Thanks for listening, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Beth. And we've been getting a few questions. And just to reply to everyone, yes, we are recording the webinar, and it will be available on WING's website and YouTube channel, and we'll be sharing with you the presentations as well. Okay, Pamala, I think we're going back to you. Yes. Fantastic.
Okay, can you put up my slides, please?
Yeah, sure. 1 second.
Yes. Okay, so thank you so much, Anna. And thank you, Beth and Chris, for your interesting presentations about your work related to global philanthropy. I will end this presentation with our conclusions from the Palgrave Handbook, in which we distilled factors that facilitate philanthropy across nations. So these facilitating factors, they focus on what country characteristics make people give more and make the nonprofit sector work better, enable nonprofit organizations to do their work better. So in order to distill these 8 facilitating factors for philanthropy, we started with asking all the authors that contribute to the Palgrave Handbook to identify the factors facilitating and inhibiting philanthropy in their own country of region of expertise. And that resulted in 136 facilitating and inhibiting factors. And with these factors, we did a thematic analysis and we identified themes, which resulted into these 8 facilitating factors. And I have to say that this is just the start of this type of research. We really need to use the data we collected in the Palgrave project, the International Philanthropy Database, which includes all the different micro-level data sets on giving in the countries that studied in the Palgrave book, to test these different facilitating factors in how well they actually explain cross-national differences in giving. But we feel that this is a start we're starting to understand the context factors that drive philanthropy, and we look forward to your feedback on these factors. The first facilitating factor we identified is the culture of philanthropy. When in a country, people believe that not only the government, but also the philanthropic sector and nonprofit organizations are responsible for providing public goods and services, then there's much more a culture of philanthropy, and nonprofits are increasingly taking over or increasingly working in fields that in other countries that the government is only working in. In a country with a lower culture of philanthropy, for example, the government is completely responsible for public goods and services in the fields of education and in health. While in a country with a strong culture of philanthropy, nonprofits are active across the whole range of causes. So this is one of the differences for a country with a strong or weak culture of philanthropy. Another difference has to do with whether philanthropy is discussed openly. In many countries across the world, people don't talk about money. The Netherlands is a clear example of that. In the Netherlands, people don't speak about their income or about money. And we also don't often speak about our philanthropic giving. And there are several countries across the world where it's not done to talk about your philanthropy, about the amount of money you give, because it's considered bragging or showing off or making use of your social status position. Interestingly, it is changing in some of the countries. For example, the authors of France discussed that they saw a trend where more wealthy individuals started to discuss their philanthropic gifts openly. So, and by discussing your philanthropic gifts openly, you encourage other people to also become philanthropists. So having an example set for your own philanthropy is important. So this can help a culture of philanthropy, talking openly about philanthropic donations. The second facilitating factor has to do with public trust. When people don't trust the nonprofit organizations they give their money to will spend it well, they will not give. In some countries, there's much more public trust than in others. And issues of transparency, accountability, and effectiveness can help increase public trust. Interestingly enough, if you look across all the countries covered in the Palgrave book, only Canada mentioned public trust as a factor increasing philanthropy. Many other countries mentioned public trust as a factor decreasing philanthropy because there are so many issues with public trust in these countries. You can look into the concluding chapter of the Palgrave Handbook if you want to know more about which countries have lower trust than others. The third facilitating factor for philanthropy is having regulatory and legislative frameworks. And there can be an upside to this and a downside. On the positive side, when you have strong regulatory and legislative frameworks, this can increase donor trust because donors think, well, it's controlled, everything is, well, people of the organizations will spend my money well. And on the other hand, it can also increase effectiveness. So because organizations need to have a certain level of professionalism in order to comply with certain regulatory and legislative frameworks in a country. But on the other hand, it can strongly increase the administrative burden of having very strict regulatory and legislative frameworks. Like Chris already mentioned, there can be a very strong state control of the nonprofit sector through these regulatory and legislative frameworks. Examples of countries in which it was mentioned that the government used these frameworks to control the nonprofit sector were Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, and Russia. So we think that government regulations can be facilitating for philanthropy under two conditions. One, that care is taken that the administrative burden is not too hard on nonprofits, and secondly, that they are enforced in a democratic society where the government doesn't misuse its powers. The fourth factor for philanthropy are fiscal incentives. Most country chapter authors mentioned fiscal incentives as a stimulating factor for philanthropy in their country. However, research doesn't examine fiscal incentives for giving outside the US very often. So we know how it works in the US, but outside we actually don't really know so much about it. So we hope with the International Philanthropy Database that we can start testing whether fiscal incentives work for philanthropy outside of the US. In all countries on the study in the Palgrave book, only Finland was the only country that doesn't have fiscal incentives for giving. The fifth facilitating factor has to do with the state of the nonprofit sector. When the nonprofit sector in a country is well-funded, well-organized, is professional, it attracts much more donations than when it is underfunded, not organized, and not professional. One part has to do of this professionalism of the nonprofit sector with the representative organizations active in these countries. These organizations can be very instrumental in creating a philanthropic infrastructure. They can help share their knowledge, and like Beth already said, they can train fundraisers, they can educate other philanthropic staff, and also they can help guide through ethical issues and set guidelines in order for the nonprofit sector in a country to be more trusted by the public. These representative organizations can also be crucial in maintaining good relationships with the state, the media, and the corporate world. And this is also a factor that was mentioned by some of the authors, that it's important that there's open communications between the different stakeholders in a country, and that they collaborate with each other on issues that are relevant for all of these actors. The sixth facilitating factor has to do with the political and economic stability or growth. One clear example where there has been no political and economic stability recently that is included in the Palgrave book is Lebanon. Abu Assi, the author of this chapter, writes that because in Lebanon it's such an insecure state, people stop giving to nonprofits. They need their money they don't feel financially secure enough in order to give, and they keep their money to themselves. And also nonprofit organizations, they stop working on causes that are not related directly to the crisis. So they focus their work on helping people that are in need at that time. This factor also relates to countries that are not in transition or in war or in economic or political distress. It also relates, for example, to the economic downturn that hit a lot of the Western countries after 2008. And because that resulted in a withdrawing government who withdraw lots of funding from the nonprofit sector, that also had a big effect on the fundraising opportunities these organizations had, or how well they could continue their programs and how well they could show what they achieved. So political and economic stability has an influence on philanthropy on different levels. The seventh factor has to do with population changes, and there's not much you can do from the outside to change this. We know that across the world, in most countries, there's a process of secularization going on. People become less religious and go to church less frequently, or to their religious institutions less frequently. This results in a decline in giving because a lot of the giving is done through religious organizations. But at the same time, people become older, they become more wealthy, and they have higher educational achievements across the world. And these are factors that we know positively affect philanthropy. So how these population changes work exactly is something we need to look into, and whether, for example, an increase in wealth and educational achievement can counter the effects of secularization will be a very interesting research question for the future. The final and fifth of 8 facilitating factor is international giving. Authors notice that international money streams such as official development assistance, migration, tourism, religious institutions, and international corporations, they do affect giving in local communities. For example, in the Caribbean, a lot of the donations were driven by tourism. People who visited the Caribbean islands came back to their own country and thought, we want to help the people on these islands, or the animals on this island, or the nature. So international giving is the final facilitating factor for philanthropy. Based on all these factors, we hope we can start new research into understanding exactly what's the context that drives philanthropic giving. What makes some people in some countries more generous than other people in other countries, and we hope to give a start with these 8 facilitating factors. Thank you so much for listening to us in this webinar. We look forward to your questions and remarks. Here you see our email addresses. Feel free to contact us at any time if you have any questions or remarks on this work, or have interesting suggestions for future research. We're always interested in it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anna, as well.
Thank you very much, Pamala, Beth, and Chris, for fantastic presentations. We have one comment here. And that's Jane Arnott from CAF UK, saying that for more information on tax incentives globally, you can see rules to give by the publication and the links on the chat box. So it concludes that tax incentives are particularly effective stimulate interest to read that. We have our first question to Chris. And about government control. That's from Dana, who co-wrote the chapter on Vietnam. And she's pointing out that during the presentation, you might have suggested that organizations might need to avoid the trap of supporting a government-controlled sector. But she found a successful nonprofit in Vietnam and points out that work might be restricted but not controlled by the government. So she'd like to know, what do you mean by government control here?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good point, and she's welcome to partially answer her own question, but the is government. Some nonprofits are government controlled, and I mean, obviously, I'm not saying don't give any money to Vietnam. I'd say give money carefully. So supporting independent nonprofits is probably one of the best things you can do. It creates a sector that's independent and able to stand up to the government.
And fantastic. And Dana, if you'd like to make any point, you can unmute yourself or just raise your hand and I'll unmute yourself. Meanwhile, we have actually a request for Beth, and if you could maybe go a little bit further on the attributes of successful fundraisers in a few countries, because people would like to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. Can you hear me there?
Yes, definitely.
Thank you. This particular study was done just across 3 countries, mostly in the UK where I'm based, but I also worked with somebody in Canada and with Wendy obviously in Australia. And we were particularly looking at the attributes of major donor fundraisers, although some of the research method did reach out to all kinds of digital corporate trust foundations, all different channels of fundraising. There's probably a few headline findings that I can tell you, and perhaps we can do another webinar on this another time, because there's a lot to say. I've been studying it for a few years now. One point, which is just to echo what I said earlier, that we're not claiming there is any particular type of person. There is no magic formula for someone who has the right characteristics to be a fundraiser. Having said that, they do tend to conform in some degree to the stereotype of the very chatty, charismatic, friendly, good conversationalist, the kind of person you want to spend time with, because relationship fundraising is exactly as the word suggests. It means you get into a relationship with the people who may be able to support you. So you need to be the kind of person that they want to spend time with and find it enjoyable to talk to and to learn about the organisation with. So I did a very extensive testing of personality traits and found that the most successful fundraisers, those who had been responsible for raising at least one donation of £1 million or more, scored more highly on the extroversion trait, which is that sort of chatty, outgoing, easy sort of to socialise kind of person. The other trait that scored highly was openness. And in fact, that scored even more highly than extroversion. So the kind of people who are interested in new ideas, who are curious, who don't like routine, who are always liking to try new things, are the kind of people who go to night classes and have lots of different hobbies. Those kind of people do seem to feature more frequently amongst the more successful fundraisers. The other thing to say really is about adaptability, which is one of the traits that seems to come through. So no matter what kind of person you are, you might be quieter, you might be more introverted, you might not be that sociable or that keen on night classes. You can still be a good fundraiser, of course, but what you bring to the ability to adapt to the person you're speaking to. So people we interviewed said things like, I can be whoever the donor needs me to be. I can dial up or dial down my personality. I can be a bit of a chameleon and be the kind of person that they want to spend time with and learn about the organisation from. So I think that would probably be my headline point, that fundraisers need to be very adaptable, great people skills, of course, very emotionally intelligent, but an ability to adjust and adapt in all the different situations that they find themselves in.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks, Beth. And if you'd like to hear more, you probably have our presenters' emails already, and you can email me at any time, or Wing staff, and we are happy to pass on the emails as well. Dana, you have your hand is raised. Can you hear me? We can't really hear you now, so if you'd like to make a point, maybe on the chat box, or send us an email at some point. So does anybody have any other questions or concerns, or would like to point out on anything on the presentations? Please feel free to unmute yourselves or write a comment. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping up our webinar here. And our presenters, do you have any final words?
I would just like to thank anyone for joining us in this presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you if you have more interesting information about global philanthropy, like the report that was shared by Jane Arnott from the Charities Aid Foundation. If you have any more of this type of information, we'd love to hear from you, and let us know if you have any questions or comments. Thank you so much, Anna, for hosting us, and thank you all the participants for listening to us. And thank you, Chris and Beth, for joining me in this webinar.
Thank you, Pamala, for your very kind words. And before we leave, I'd like to point out that should save the date, because we've been talking, our presenters have been talking about the CAF, and Jade provided us with a link of a great resource. And our next webinar will be about the World Giving Index 2015 and highlighting some emerging markets as well. So to have more information on global philanthropy, we're very glad there's a lot available right now on the topic. And so our webinar will be on February 2nd at 4 p.m. UTC. Hope you can join us back then, and we'll send more information over email. So thank you everyone for joining us, and hope you have a good day. Thank you.